quite a few. I guess three stand out in my mind. One, I remember being in Kamau's class when he was teaching the solo performance workshop, and he made us write the top 10 things I'm afraid to say out loud. And you had to stand up on stage and say it to the 8 other people who were in the class with you out loud and without looking down at the paper, making eye contact. And if you weren't like shaking or crying, he'd be like, you didn't do your homework, try it again. And number 3 on that list, I don't even remember 1 and 2, but number 3 on that list was, I'm afraid I'm not Muslim. And he said, well, I think you are. And I said, well, it's not up to you. And he said, well, then who is it up to? And I was like, oh my God, mind blown. And that I was like, oh my God, who is it up to? It's up to my father.
I am really excited about my next guest, Zahra Noorbakhsh. This is the first time that I'm getting to interview a comedian. And I know that this is going to be a really fun conversation. Zahra is the co-host of the blockbuster podcast, Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. She also is an author. She is a contributor to the book Love Inshallah, which I had the pleasure of reading several years ago. She's also doing stand-up comedy, and we'll let Zahra talk about that. But Zahra describes herself as a Muslim feminist Iranian-American activist comedian. That's a lot of words there. So Zahra, welcome to the show.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you. I had the pleasure of listening to your podcast a few times, and it was really fun to hear you and your co-host Taz. So I'm going to start with your comedy. And, you are a very funny person. And I'm curious, when was the first time you realized that you had this talent of telling funny stories?
Yeah, definitely when I was a little kid. I always just loved telling stories. My mom says that ever since I was 2, I was like babbling stories and making gestures, thinking that everybody just understood.
So Zahra, tell us about the podcast. It's such an interesting name, like Good Muslim, Bad Muslim. And I'm just curious how you landed in the podcast world and what you're trying to do with your message.
Yes, the podcast started when Taz and I started the hashtag. We met each other on the book tour for Love Inshallah, the anthology that we're both in. We both kind of had the sexy stories. And I would be on Twitter, say something like, when your husband doesn't eat pork, but you do, hashtag bad Muslim, and then Taz would make a claim and hashtag herself, the good or bad Muslim. And then we started saying good, bad Muslim. And then we started pretending that we had a podcast. And so for a year on Twitter, we just went back and forth telling each other jokes with the hashtag next time on Good Muslim, Bad Muslim, our podcast, pretending like we had one. And after a while, people started asking us, I went to go look for your podcast and I didn't see it.
Mm-hmm.
We were like, maybe we should do this. So there was a lot of lead up, and we didn't really have the technical skills, but one of Taz's coworkers, or one of Taz's friends, ended up being our sound engineer and helping us with that. And thus the podcast was born. His name is Quincy Sursmith. He's our producer.
That's great. And it's been a real positive response so far. And I know that Oprah even referred to it.
Yeah, we've been to the White House. We recorded an episode at the White House in our second year. We were featured in Oprah magazine in our first year. It's just been a whirlwind. I usually stress to people that we have a very unique origin story as a podcast. It doesn't normally go this way for a podcast. Usually a podcast you have for at least a year, but some podcasts 3 years, some have been up for 11 years before they get the kind of recognition that we've been getting. And I think that's, in large part because before we sort of came together, we both were performers and speakers in our own right. And so we kind of joined forces, cross-pollinated, and it's been a roller coaster ride.
That's awesome. That's really great to hear. When I was listening to your podcast, I was reminded of improv, because hosting with someone else, there's a lot of yes and I mean, do you feel like maybe it is unplanned, right? It's like thinking on your feet and just going with the flow. Is that how it works?
There's definitely a lot of thinking on your feet. I mean, we do agenda our podcast. Sometimes we spend up to 6 hours researching before we start. And we used to think that that was just because we weren't organized enough. We would try to start earlier, but we realized it's because the news cycle, when it comes to issues that affect Muslims anywhere, the turnover is so high, and within hours the news changes dramatically. And so we aren't really able to complete our agenda until like the morning before we start recording. And there is like some elements that we pre-plan in terms of like stuff we want to talk about, and then there are some things that we specifically want to surprise each other with or just come up as a result of the conversation. I'm definitely much more dialogue oriented. Taz really likes to have time to sort of like think about the issues on her own time and then sort of like present them. And I really discover stuff in dialogue, which is a big part of why I love performing live on stage as a comedian.
I think comedy is probably one of the hardest things to do for any person. I mean, I think normally people have this fear of public speaking, but comedy is like at the next level. I just wonder like what your first experience was like actually walking up to that mic in a club and being surrounded by all these people. Like, were you nervous? Were you sweating? Were you like, oh my God, what did I get myself into? Was it fight and flight? What was that experience like?
Oh, I loved it. I mean, I think as a comedian, you just sort of, part of why you want to become a comedian is because you naturally gravitate toward that experience. You want to be in a conversation with a room full of people. I think the marker of a comedian is you go up on stage and you bomb, and then you can't wait to get back up on stage again. I think that's really when you know that you want to be a comedian.
Mm-hmm.
It's just like a way that I'm built. It's not really like that part of it isn't something that you learn. I think it's just something that you have in the way that you interpret experiences. So people always talk about how terrifying it must be, or like how, intense of a public speaking endeavor it is, but it's such a specific art form. Somebody who is a comedian doesn't necessarily make a great public speaker because you have a lot of control as a comedian. You have control over your content. You are learning to establish control in your audience dynamic. I think a lot of people don't realize how much of a magic trick comedy is,
Mm-hmm.
because it seems so casual and it seems so conversational, so it must be. But actually, the comedians that you see, for instance, that are quote unquote debuting on television have been doing it for a minimum of 6 to 8 years.
So I have a lot of experience.
A lot of experience. The average comedian, like always, if not at least for the first 6 years of their career, is performing 3 to 6 nights a week.
Wow.
When you're thinking about like how you do a magic trick or a complicated magic trick, there's like an incredible amount of training that you have to do with like all the tendons in your hands and like making sure your fingers are like quick with movement and you've like coordinated. And then you have to also learn how to do it so that it looks casual, so that you can distract the people that you're trying to entertain so that they don't see the magic trick coming. It's like a joke and a punchline, yeah.
So is that something that you've been able to master over time? Like, is that something that you've had to, hone in and practice?
That's the constant endeavor. I was just watching TJ Miller in a late night show. He was talking about how he wanted to move back to New York because there he could get 6 sets per night. And it just really struck me that somebody at his level is still seeking so much stage time.
Mm-hmm.
And it just tells you, how much work it takes to find that material. Definitely, like, I think you already gravitate towards that kind of an experience with an audience anyways. There have been so many times that I wanted to quit comedy, but I was just so miserable. I can either take antidepressants or I can perform 3 nights a week and I feel fantastic.
That's really interesting. I'm interested to hear your perspective because, we think of comedians as very funny people and like they're constantly laughing and they're in a jolly good mood, but it's not the case, right? And we've learned from Robin Williams, and it's a very complicated persona in the sense that I find that comedians are complex people. And I wonder if you identify yourself as complex in that way.
Oh, definitely. Definitely. I think that's why comedians do so well as writers, as entertainers, because you have to develop your voice in order to build a following as a comedian. In a story, you can rely on a story's arc and a story's dramatic tension to keep an audience's attention. For a comedian, your punchlines have to do that for you every 10 seconds.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, you have to sort of dive into the complexities of your life. You know, a long time ago when I was struggling to be a comedian in the San Francisco Bay Area, Kamau Bell was my teacher. He was my solo performance teacher. He was my mentor in a lot of ways. He used to tell me, don't try to be funny on stage. You are funny. When you get angry, it comes out funny. You're a funny person, and that's it. And everything else is just going to line itself up when you talk about what enrages you on stage. And he was so right.
So a lot of times, even when you're just being Zahra yourself.
Yeah, yeah. And I think a lot of writers talk about that too, of like how to let go of all of the formality of writing and let your voice come through.
Right, absolutely. I mean, I think that's goes back to like authenticity, which, I see that a lot from you. You're very open about things, and even in the podcast, you are pretty vulnerable. I'm not going to say that you're a bad Muslim. Sometimes you call yourself that. In the podcast, you've already like established that like I'm a pork eating, I'm a drinking. These are all the things that I've done as a Muslim woman. And I know that like last year you made a big confession, and this was shortly after the Orlando nightclub incident. And I'm just wondering like what led you to make that big reveal about yourself and to open up.
Yeah, last year I came out as bisexual, and I felt it was really important to do, even though I'm in a straight passing relationship. I'm in a very heteronormative marriage. We don't have an open relationship. So for years I was able to not have to come out, and there was always this question of like, well, how gay are you to be able to take up queer space? And after the Orlando shooting, it felt so necessary to come out because there were so many people who were standing in solidarity as Muslims with the queer community, quote unquote, but then at the same time silencing their own children who were wanting to come out as queer. It just wasn't right. And I was hearing so many people, from scholars to imams to your average everyday Muslim, whatever that is, just saying, it's not possible. You can't be gay and Muslim. And I just found that so obnoxious. It sounds so much like the same rhetoric that I received around, you can't be feminist and Muslim. Is that possible? Is that possible? And it just keeps like stacking up. It's like, can you be an athlete and feminist and Muslim? Is that possible? And so I knew that this was wrong, and I felt the need to take up space and say, I'm bisexual and I'm Muslim, and I don't think that those two worlds conflict with each other. And that was an incredibly rewarding experience. There were so many people who said and wrote to me that it gave them hope that they could have that conversation with their family one day as well.
I know that was a very scary experience for you. Well, I wouldn't call it scary, but uncomfortable, because you were worried about reactions from your family.
Yeah, it was definitely scary. It was definitely a frightening experience. I didn't know at the time. I had taken for granted how much fear you live with just on a day-to-day basis as an out homosexual being. When you're out and gay, like, you just don't know when somebody is going to come at you because they're homophobic. And so I didn't know, like, all of these people who are in my life who say that they stand up for gay rights, what about when it's in their own community, their friends' kids, my parents? I had no idea. And that was a really profound realization for me, especially as like we all like to think of ourselves as like liberal-minded progressives. And it really made me realize how much I was taking for granted as a person who is straight passing.
Yeah, no, absolutely. It almost goes back to, your message even through the podcast, right? Which is good Muslim, bad Muslim. Like, there's never either or, right? We're all complicated people. And it kind of reminds me of Maya Angelou's quote where she said, "You're only free when you realize you belong no place. You belong every place." What does that mean
Yeah,
to you?
I think it's the perfect quote to respond to your earlier question about how I walk that line of vulnerability. My parents came here so that I could live a life free of fear. Iran was going through the revolution, so much was changing, and my parents made a conscious choice to raise their two daughters here so that we would have more opportunities afforded to us and so that we weren't living in a war-torn country and we're living without fear. So I feel entitled to that. I feel entitled to a life that I can live that is my authentic self, that is without fear. Not that fear doesn't come up, but that the fear should let me know what I need to overcome as opposed to what realities I should accept.
That's amazing. I mean, is that something that you constantly have to work on, especially now living in this environment where there's a lot of Islamophobia and there's a lot of fear from Muslims? I mean, you address a lot of that in your podcast as well. This is a time of a lot of fear, but also I'm noticing a lot more dialogue. And this is why I think your podcast is so important, because there's a lot of misconceptions out there. And I know that you talk a lot about that, about like reclaiming words, I mean, words like jihad, which is a very scary word to a lot of people. And, immediately you think of like ISIS or whatever. And so I know that's something that you're trying to do through your message.
Yeah, like recently, Linda Sarsour used the word jihad in the context of self-preservation, saying basically that the pen is mightier than the sword. And she was horribly attacked for it, and that to me is an example of how much work we have to do as activists working with the identity of Muslim, is to reclaim these terms because they're being used to criminalize. We can't let anybody do that. We can't let anybody take terms that are religious words and make them criminal. And the word jihad is so prevalent in the Quran, in Muslim scholarly work, as self-preservation. So yeah, I think we have to sort of be on our toes and be on top of that, because the fear industrial complex running against Muslims is a $206 million campaign that is very real. It was exposed by Wajahat Ali and many others in 2015. You can look it up. And so we have a lot of work to do to work against the expectation of a return on investment of a $206 million campaign.
What do you think Muslims can do, like American Muslims can do, to help, reverse that perception?
I think the number one thing that a lot of Muslims need to do is to realize that there is no one right kind of Muslim. I think that doesn't help anybody in terms of strategy. You may walk around with that belief in your head. I think that that's a very religious approach, right? Like, one of the reasons why I know I'm not an atheist and that I'm a religious person is that I do believe that the way that I see my religion and the way that I observe it is the right way. But I don't enforce that in the world. And I think that Muslims really fall into a trap that's being laid for them when they try to identify a standard of Muslimness. Because when we do that, then we also allow ourselves to be identified as an ethnicity. And there is a real effort, fiscal, tangible effort being made right now to reduce the identity of Muslim to one of terrorist. And the more we hand the right, these conservatives, these fear mongers, the more we hand them oversimplifications of ourselves as people, demographically, geographically, culturally, the more we're just making their job easier.
So do you think that there should be more diversity in the media of the Muslim? There should be more diversity, and then also like dialogue?
Well, I think one of the things that the media, that new media has done that is a magic trick of its own, right, that we really need to find a way to undo, is to invent this term Muslim as a catch-all. It is not at all specifying in any way, shape, or form, but we've come to believe that it does. We've come to believe that there is a community of Muslims that all think the same. Yeah, I mean, when I realized this really when I was a part of the anthology Love Inshallah, and the editors would redline every time I wrote a traditional Muslim family. I came from a traditional Muslim family, and I was like, isn't it obvious? And they said no, and by the way, all 25 of you keep using that phrase. And
interesting.
Yeah, and when you read the book, like, one of the things I love about that anthology is that you have stories within the same book that wholly contradict each other.
Right. No, that's why I love the book, because it was so refreshing.
I realized, like, as I was reading someone else's story, thinking back in my mind that at one point they were calling their family a traditional Muslim family, and I don't see them as traditional at all. They don't remind me of my family, and that made me realize that I was really drinking the Kool-Aid that they're serving when it comes to this notion that Muslim is an identifier that makes sense. Like when we talk about ISIS, for example, the Islamic State, we shouldn't refer to them as the Islamic State. And in fact, in the Middle East, they're not referred to that way. They're referred to as Daesh, which also is an acronym that paints them as bigots. If you were to take Muslim out of the equation, people would refer to them as genocidal militants,
Right.
and how much more specific is that already, right? As opposed to labeling them as Islamic and setting up any Muslim in an interview to have to work backwards from people's expectation that they are some credible show of Islam. It's a straw man fallacy, basically, that we all just keep falling for. So I think one of the most important things that needs to happen is we need to keep pushing our media, our journalists, not to take for granted the word Muslim as an identifier of a person.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Do you think that as a result of your podcast, you've changed people's hearts and minds?
Yeah, I know that I have, because of the emails that I receive, the messages that I get. I know that there are people who see Muslims differently. I always hate using the word myself, Muslims, but who see that experience differently, who come to understand what it is I mean when I say that retaining the complexity of all of the cultures and geographies and demographics that adhere to this faith, why that's so important.
I'm sure, like, your path hasn't been easy, and we talked about, like, even in comedy, like, there's a lot of failure, and you really have to have a lot of resilience. What was an experience that really defined you as a person? I mean, I see you as a very resilient person, so I wonder if there was that one moment, one failure that you had where it changed who you are.
Oh, I have so many failures in mind. There's such a laundry list of failures.
It's Silicon Valley, fail forward.
Can we get my parents in here to just help you with that list of failures? I've had quite a few. I guess 3 stand out in my mind. One, I remember being in Kamau's class when he was teaching the solo performance workshop, and he made us write the top 10 things I'm afraid to say out loud. And you had to stand up on stage and say it to the 8 other people who were in the class with you out loud and without looking down at the paper, making eye contact. And if you weren't like shaking or crying, he'd be like, "You didn't do your homework, try it again." And number 3 on that list, I don't even remember 1 and 2, but number 3 on that list was, "I'm afraid I'm not Muslim." And he said, "Well, I think you are." And I said, "Well, it's not up to you." And he said, "Well, then who is it up to?" And I was like, oh my God, mind blown. And that I was like, oh my God, who is it up to? It's up to my father. Like, it's up to my dad, and there I was, this like 25-year-old feminist, right? Like thinking, I don't need my father to define me. But then I was walking around like, my dad decides if I am or I'm not. And that was where the one woman show that I have, the play I wrote, All Atheists Are Muslim, a romantic comedy, was birthed out of, was, having this atheist boyfriend, wanting to move in with him and not wanting to have to hide it to my parents and wanting to be able to tell them, and also telling my father, I don't know how Muslim I am. And he reaffirmed for me, it's not up to anybody but you. Like, nobody gets between you and Allah. And that was a really profound experience where I thought I was failing myself as a Muslim. I thought I was failing myself as a feminist, but in fact, I did fail forward, like they say in Silicon Valley.
And it sounds like you really look up to your dad.
Oh, definitely. My dad is the first feminist that I knew.
Which is like contrary to like what people think of Iranians, right? Like what was that movie, Not Without My Daughter or whatever that,
Yeah.
Yeah.
I am so liked by that title. I can't tell you how many. It's not even a good movie, and people just keep asking, have you seen Not Without My Daughter? It's like a Lifetime movie. It's not even very good. But our like the stereotyping that happens is that like, it's very patriarchal and, not at all feminist, and in fact chauvinist and misogynistic. And not that all of that is not true. I would certainly say that there are many families I know that are Iranian that are very patriarchal. My family growing up was very patriarchal. We live in a patriarchy. People always forget this. Yeah, when it comes to feminism, I think intersectional feminism is so important because it doesn't allow people to sort of like put themselves on this pedestal as though they are above the patriarchy in some way. But anyways, yeah, growing up, my father had 2 daughters and a wife that he was responsible for. And I think that level of responsibility also really weighed on him. And it was so important to him for us to be self-sufficient. And he also grew up with a single mother. His mom was, played the role of father and mother in his house. And so he really always saw women as people who need to be self-sustaining. And so that's always been really important to him with us.
That's great. It sounds like he really supported you in your career choice as well, which is, I know for a lot of Asian families, there's still a lot of the like, you have to be a doctor, you got to be an engineer, he really supported your creativity.
I do want to give a little bit of love to that inclination of so many immigrant families, especially first generation families, because, we do put all of this like pressure as second generationers. We also experience a lot of pressure that like cool parents let you do cool things, right? Mm-hmm. But a lot of what people forget is that, for instance, during the Japanese internment, which could be a very real reality for Muslims, the first people rounded up were doctors and lawyers. These are occupations that keep a community safe. Mm-hmm. My brother's life was threatened as a result of having a cancer that his doctor refused to give tests for. Back during the time of having one primary care doctor that had to make all your choices, this doctor refused to sign off on MRIs. He took one look at my mom and he said, listen, I know your people, you treat your sons like princes.
Wow.
He's fine.
Like he was racist and he was discriminating against you because of your background.
He was a white doctor who was racist and he was sexist. My mom is herself a nurse, so she knew what she was talking about. And she's been here since she was 14 years old, Yeah, he was very racist and he was very sexist, and he just made this statement and he said, if you disagree with me, then you're going to have to wait a month and go over my head, and put his foot down. It's moments like that where you really want to be able to have access to care from people within your own community who aren't going to treat you that way. I do, especially in the wake of the Muslim bans and how many lawyers worked pro bono for how many hours to see it through, to see that stay through, and to keep that fight going. We do need our doctors and lawyers.
No, thank you for saying that, because I think we do back on a lot of the, immigrant expectations. So that's a very poignant point that you made. How do you take care of yourself? Like, what do you do to rejuvenate?
Yeah, that's always the question, right? I have a lot of tactics, and I've had to come up with a lot of tactics because my mode of being in the world is not the cookie cutter mold of being. Like, even in school, I struggled because I'm so relational and so extroverted, and dialogue is so key to my being able to understand a concept or understand what it is that I want to say. And I'm such a tactile learner, I have to do it myself to really get it. So I know that my body is really important to me in so many ways. And I've learned over the years to not listen to my body, and I've had to really unlearn that. And that's been really hard. And I think that's really been key, because it's always been the last thing that I consult. I've always been very cerebral before the last few years. And because of the very strategic exhaustion that the far right continues to put us through, I've had to really scale back and really listen to my body and be careful not to overexert myself, because it catches up with you, right?
Yeah, you can't
And
like have an empty fuel tank, right? Because your car's gonna start dying.
yeah, and I used to do that thing, and I still do it sometimes, where it's like you're running on fumes and then you just keep running, and like your brain starts to evaporate and you don't realize how irritable you are, how short you're being, how like linear your mind is becoming, how narrow-minded you're seeing things, and pretty soon your creativity dies. And what happened for me was that, like, the way that would manifest was with a mountain of self-doubt. And I've actually learned, thanks to the help of Jenny Yang also, who's been my coach, as two women who are comedians, sort of carving a path as activist comedians, as women doing it. She's been really key to helping me see this. And one of the things that I started to identify was, when I'm spent, when my body's exhausted, is when I start to doubt myself the most. My rationalization that, I don't hear, that I just do, is, well, if I expect that I'm going to fail at this, and I doubt that I'm going to be successful, and I doubt that I have anything to give to this endeavor, then I don't force myself to go through it. And I take a break.
Right.
I take a break. And so what was happening was that failure was my only opportunity for a break.
Interesting.
And it sounds really terrible to like say it took a measure of productivity to then take a break for myself, right? Because like everything is always in service of productivity, and that's terrible. But that's what it took for me, was that I needed to see, wow, whenever I'm burned out and I'm exhausted is when I actually feel the most self-doubt and I'm the most self-persecutorial, because then I will take a break.
I mean, that correlates to sleep, right? Like the less sleep you get, the less creative you are, the less,
Absolutely.
the less productive you are. So that makes a ton of sense. So Zahra, what's your definition of success?
I've gone through so many definitions. I now continue to measure success as where my mind and body and soul are one. And it sounds corny to say that, but the alignment has really been my focus. Because what I notice is, where my soul needs to see impact in the world, then that gives me information and that guides me. And where, my mind is struggling, then I check to see what's going on with my body. And where my mind is happy, but my body is struggling, that also gives me information. Because I used to see success as this sort of like very linear approach of like A to B to C to Z, right?
Right.
And I've heard mentors of mine say this also, where you achieve the thing that you thought was the pinnacle and you've got that, and then now what? I'm fortunate to be able to say that, I always thought putting on my one-woman show would be that definitive moment. And I did that. And then it was like, now what? And then I thought, oh, when I'm published, and I did that, and it was, now what? And I thought, oh, I'll be on Fresh Air. That's like the pinnacle. And then
you were
I
just
did that too.
interviewed by Terry Gross, right? So yeah.
I didn't get interviewed by her. I've had two pieces now contributed to their show, where I read my personal essay. And that was like mind blowing, So I think that ambitious people, women who are tuning into this podcast, you already have a natural inclination to overcome and achieve, right?
Right.
And so you have to have sometimes a success plan. Like, we always think to have like a backup strategy for when we fail, but actually it could be just as disorienting to achieve those things that you've always been seeking.
Yeah, because you're still hungry.
Yeah. And I mean, for me at least, I sort of like had this definition of who I would be achieving those things. I realized, it's not a linear process, and it's not a linear experience. And so you have to have some kind of metric.
Yeah, very true. And also like just an endpoint.
Yeah, the endpoints are nice, aren't they? Like as I get older, I'm like, God, like I've recently been thinking about what I'm missing out as a result of not being a mom. Like, because my friends who have children, as a woman in her later 30s, I really am envious of my friends that are like, well, 8 o'clock is bedtime for my kids. And so around 7 o'clock is when we have wind down, and they're doing all these things for their kids, but also they're sort of like having this routine in their house. And I'm like so envious of routines right now.
So do you think about being a mom someday?
Oh yeah, definitely. It's very hard as a comedian because you're traveling all the time. So that's not the best thing for a pregnancy is to be on a lot of planes.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. I want to part with like, how do you want to be remembered? Like what would you want your legacy to be?
Oh wow. I think as somebody who fought for the right to be vulnerable, I'll say that.
Yeah, that's what you're doing. You are living your legacy every minute.
Thank you for the time and the space to explore it and share it. This has been so lovely.
Yeah, no, this has been a really great conversation, and I'm so grateful to you, and I wish you all the best in all of your creative pursuits. And I wish you all the best in changing hearts and minds. We need people like you in the community.
Thank you. To you and your listeners as well.
So Zahra, how can the listeners find you?
You can contact me by going to my website, zahracomedy.com. I have a contact tab there. You can email me, zahra@zahracomedy.com, and tell me what you thought of this interview or my other work.
And where can listeners find your podcast?
Oh, thank you for reminding me. Go to goodmuslimbadmuslim.com, and you can stream it from the website, or you can listen to it on your favorite podcast app, or on Stitcher, or on iTunes, or on Audio Boom, all those things.
Thank you, Zahra. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I hope that you got some revealing confessions to help you in your journey to success. To nominate a guest on this podcast, send an email to info@confessionsofsuccessfulasianwomen.com.